Hello, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Lira, and today I'm presenting on mass media influences our social perception of crime and violence. Before this course, I believe crime stories in the media were factual reflections of reality. After studying John Curra's textbook and research articles, I now understand deviance as a social construct. For example, during the Prohibition in the 1920s, alcohol consumption was criminalized even though it was socially acceptable before. I also learned that mass media frames crime based on audience appeal, not accuracy. For instance, Black Lives Matter's protests were often portrayed as violent in some media outlets, even though most demonstrations were peaceful, according to Corda. Now I recognize that media not only informs but also shapes public's consciousness. This is learning has been informed by readers such as the construction of the crack mother icon Carpenter, which showed how race, gender, and poverty intersect in media portrayals, and Curtis, The Relativity of Deviance, which taught that deviance is not inherited, it is an act, but defined by social reaction. Now, I don't just accept crime news, I question how and why it's presented the way it is. Mass media heavily overrepresents violent crimes like murder, despite FBI and BJS data showing that violent crimes are account for a small fraction of all crimes. True crime shows like the Dateline NBC and 48 Hours centralize murder cases, making rare events seem more common. Historically, the war on drugs in the 1980s framed crack cocaine users, largely African Americans, as dangerous criminals. This led to harsher sentences laws. Similarly, after 9/11, media coverage magnified fears of terrorism, resulting in the Patriot Act and the widespread racial profiling of Muslim Americans. A more recent event would be during the times of COVID, where Asian Americans were being victims of racial profiling and racial hate. Today, political ads use selections of violent crimes imagery to influence voters, despite the BJS showing that the overall violent crime has declined by 70% since the 1993. This graph supports the statement that since the 1990s, crime has dropped. However, media narratives do not reflect this trend, contributing to the continued fear and support for the punitive policies. Yes, mass media creates unwanted levels of fear. It is also creating the stereotypes. African Americans and Latinos are overly represented as criminals on TV news, even though actual crime rates don't match these portrayals. Carpenter's audio article on the crack mother shows how media vilified African American women as inherently criminal and unfit, fueling the punitive policies like mandatory sentencing. Historically, the crack epidemic was framed as a criminal issue for Black communities, while today's opioid crisis, mostly affecting white Americans, is framed as a health crisis. These media frames stick and they label certain groups unfairly, shaping how society treats them. For example, the coverage of the 1980s crack epidemic focused on African American inner city communities, portraying users as criminals. Meanwhile, today's opioid epidemic affecting the large white rural areas is often framed as a health crisis, deserving some type of sympathy. Institutions like the media, justice system, and political bodies are interconnected in reinforcing these stereotypes, as Curta discussed. Peer reviewed studies also show how racial minorities are depicted disproportionately as perpetrators in news stories, even though crime data does not support that bias. American fear remains disproportionately high. This disconnect is driven by sensationalized news coverage, which overrepresents violent crime while neglecting all the property and white collar criminals. Comparing the sources, John Kerr emphasizes deviance as socially constructed and influenced by those in power. This explains deviance as a relative to time, place, and context. while Introvalda emphasizes how media exposure magnifies the perceptions of deviance across social groups. Both acknowledge the audience effects, fear differs by race, gender, and class. Peer reviewed research shows how media exaggerates minority criminality and public fear. BJS data confirms violent crimes rates have significantly dropped, but the media coverage has not reflected this decrease. For example, although the data reports that robbery rates fell by over 60% from 1995 to 2023, yet robbery remains a staple in nightly news criminal segments. This supports Kurta's and Introva's claim that fear is shaped more by media than the actual reality. Different sociological perspectives help explain this media influence. Media induced fear might be served as a function by promoting the conformality, but also pathologizes certain populations. From a functionalistic view, media portrays deviance to reinforce social norms, showing consequences when people break the rules. Conflict theory is especially relevant here. It argues that media reflects elite interests. It's used to protect powerful people by criminalizing poor and minority communities and distracting them from the systematic inequalities. And symbolic interactionalism shows us that media creates labels, calling certain people criminals based on images and repeated narratives. The repeated exposure to particular narratives, such as the violent black man, or the mentally ill shooter, or the drunk Indian, creates a cycle where viewers expect deviance from labeled groups. In conclusion, mass media greatly influences how we see crime and deviance. It fuels the public fear, promotes stereotypes, and often distorts reality when the actual crime rate has dropped. Public perception shaped by both traditional and social media suggests otherwise. Through functionalism, conflict, and symbolic interactionalism lens, we see how media, crime, and social control are interlinked by both obvious and the subtle ways. BJS data 2024 shows how Americans are safer now more than they were 30 years ago. But sensationalized media narratives create fear and division. By applying a critical lens using theoretical framework and real data, we can barely understand. We better understand now how crime and deviance are socially constructed and manipulated. As informed viewers, it's important for us that we look beyond the headlines and check the data to better understand the crime in our area. And here are the references of all the sources used throughout my presentation. Thank you.